You're watching BATV, bringing Brookline home.
Hello, I'm Karma Kitai, and I am your host for A Livelihood, New Adventures as We Age. And if you've watched this show before, you know we interview people over age 50 who have started any new and exciting adventures. So today I'm going to introduce you to David Goulet, who is very involved in a project in the sister city in Nicaragua. So let me welcome you, David.
Thank you so much.
So I've talked to you a little bit about your history, where you've been and where you are now, and I know you're very involved. In fact, you're the VP, you told me, of this sister city between Newton and
It's called San Juan del Sur. And of course, Brookline has a sister city in Nicaragua also.
Brookline does also.
Quetzalcoatl. And Providence has one, and Concord has one, and Pittsfield has one, and Bennington has one, and New Haven has one.
Many.
And so these go back to the 1980s. We've had ours for almost 25 years.
Right, and we actually did interview Carol Caro a few years ago, who is the person who's involved with the Sister City project.
And we keep in touch with each other. Brookline and Newton are very close.
Yeah. Right, so you have many projects going on.
Yes, my plate's very full.
And you and your wife, actually, Margaret, who has also been on this show, I know spend quite a bit of time actually in Nicaragua.
Right.
And probably thinking about it and organizing things. And
we're both writers and activists. So we both spend time in front of our computers, but we also spend time in the field, largely in Nicaragua, although I have other things I do around the Boston area as well.
Yeah. And I know that you haven't always done this. You were an English professor at Simmons College, correct?
My joke is that, like the typical English professor, I, in midlife, turned to public health, which in fact is what I'm doing now down in Nicaragua, which is very fascinating. But you know.
Well, I thought when you told me that, what does this have to do with being an English professor?
Well, it's
so
kind of
how
odd.
did you make that transition?
I'm a poet also. And I have a book of poems that I hope will be coming out in the coming year. I've written 2 books about poetry in Nicaragua, about revolutionary poetry in Nicaragua. The Nicaraguans had their great revolution in 1979 when they overthrew the Somoza dynasty. And a lot of poets were involved in that, and one of the best poets. So
did you get interested in Nicaraguan poetry even before you got involved with the project?
It's a curious story. I first went to Nicaragua in the mid-'80s with a friend of mine who happens to be an Episcopal priest in New York City named Steve Chinland. We went down and spent a week there talking to everyone. He said, I want to see this revolution made by priests, Roman Catholic priests in this case mostly. And among the priests I met was the great poet and religious leader Ernesto Cardenal, who was on Somoza's kill list for a long time. He was, because he had revolutionary tendencies. When the revolutions succeeded, Ernesto became the Minister of Culture, and he's been my mentor over the years and helped me with these first 2 books. Both of them about how poetry allows revolutionary feelings to rise to the surface.
I see. So that's the link between...
That's the sort of link between my academic career and my writing career. I have sort of academic interest in the history of poetry and how poetry affects society. So that's one side. And in the midst of that came Nicaragua, or rather Nicaragua came first, and it seemed an obvious thing to do, to write about the experience of poetry in this country, where when the revolution triumphed, when the insurrection triumphed, only about 20% of the people in the country knew how to read. They closed all the high schools and the colleges for a year and sent high school and college kids out into the countryside to live with campesino, that means country families, work with them during the day, open a kerosene lantern at night, take out the pens and pencils and paper, and they taught everyone in the family how to read. And they reversed that. Instead of 20 knowing how to read and 80 being illiterate, by the end of that, 80% could read and only 20% were illiterate. Wow. Out of that also came a number of poetry workshops. All over the country, newly literate people were learning how to write poetry.
Wow, how remarkable is that, huh?
Yeah, it's wonderful. And
so when you go down there now, do you do any poetry writing workshops?
No, I don't at all. No, as you'll see from some of our slides, the Newton Sister City project, Margaret and I, each of us has a different project. She has her free high school for adults, because if you're over 18, if you've ever been married, if you have a kid, you can't go to the public high school. There's a huge population of people that need to go to high school and haven't until now been able to, but now Rosalena Bello, who's Margaret's colleague and now the mayor of our town, first woman mayor, founded this high school 10 years ago. I do several things which we'll show you some slides of. When we began to visit people in the backwoods of San Juan del Sur, we realized a number of things. One was that the water they were drinking was really terrible. They're mostly hand-dug wells. There are animals running everywhere. There are latrines rather than flush toilets. So that typically these wells are full of E. coli bacteria and parasite cysts, which are like the eggs for parasites, as well as occasionally some viruses. So I discovered while cruising on the internet a wonderful invention that some Canadians have now made famous around the world, called the biosand filter, which is a column of sand. You take the contaminated water, run it down through the column of sand very slowly, it comes out a spout, and what that sand does is to eliminate 100% of parasite cysts and about 95% of E. coli bacteria, which are the bacteria that kill babies. You know, they give them chronic diarrhea and they die of dehydration. So I see we've got a slide here. This is not our first slide, but let me talk about this right here. Traditionally, the biosand filters, there are about 1 million of them around the world, in Southeast Asia and Africa and other parts of the world. They have traditionally been made out of cement, and we made about 700 of them and distributed them to families made out of cement. They're incredibly heavy, 333 pounds without the sand in them. A couple of people said, why don't we try to make these out of large pieces of plastic? My friend Dennis St. John, who divides his time between Rockport, Massachusetts, and a little town in Arizona, designed one made out of 10-inch PVC pipe, the kind of pipe that you use for water mains. And then in the photograph we just saw, a graduate student at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania said, why don't we try to make one out of the regular 5-gallon bucket that everyone uses in their gardens? And she tried that in her lab. She had good results, and she said, could you help me do field trials, really on location, which is what we did last January. So what we've got, what you see in this picture here is a stack of what we call not filters, full filters, they're sort of half filters, filtritos. They're very good for a small family of 2 or 3 or 4 people, whereas the bigger ones made out of the PVC pipes, which are twice as tall and have twice as much sand, are really better for large families because they produce 40 liters of purified water an hour. So, and again, without electricity, without chemicals, in the comfort of your home. There are some rules you have to follow, because if you don't use these every day, they stop functioning. And if you take your water filtered into a storage bucket and you don't scrub your storage bucket with a little chlorine about once a week, the water may get recontaminated. But most people actually are capable of doing these 2 things. Using it every day, keeping their buckets clean, and suddenly they have sweet tasting. I've tasted it myself. It's delicious water. And it's absolutely safe.
And it doesn't infect people.
Absolutely not. It's decontaminated. So that's one of the things. Here we see one of the larger filters. This is that gray thing is a piece of PVC pipe, 10 inches wide. And the white pillar you see coming up the center is the pipe that draws the water up from the inside, because inside there's a level of water like this, which pushes the water down through the sand and then up the pipe. When the pipe level and the water level inside are at the same, the water stops coming out. If you put more on the top, more water comes out. And it feeds with a little transparent plastic pipe right into that red bucket, which is the storage bucket. And down at the bottom is a little tap. So this young mother with her darling child has everything she needs to produce clean water in the home. She goes out to her well, which is just outside the house, lifts that little wooden top, pours in, let's say, I don't know, 10, 15 liters of water. It gurgles down, slowly works its way, pushes its way down through the sand. Actually, what it's doing is it's pushing out the water that she put in last night. The water she puts in the top is not what comes out. It's the water that's been sitting there. And sitting there, many of the bacteria which haven't been caught on the sharp pieces of sand or otherwise been deprived of oxygen and food have simply died. I'm going to tell you something amazing about this, a curious invention. The doctor who, the scientist who invented it, his name is David Mantz, was working on sand filtration in Guatemala. People have used sand to filter water for centuries. The Egyptians used to use it to filter water. But what Mantz discovered is that he was using these big cement boxes, about the size of a water cooler, of sand. And he found that after 2 weeks of use, the water was much cleaner and more bacteria-free than on the first day. And he couldn't figure out quite how. He did some experiments with the sand. He discovered that during those 2 weeks, the top layer of sand had developed what we call a biolayer, a protozoa-rich layer of organic critters, little animalitos, that trap and eat E. coli bacteria. In short, there is a living biolayer of what we call bacteria buena, good bacteria, which eat the bacteria mala, the bad bacteria. And this is the way we explain it to folks. They say, well, we say, this is your new pet, your new mascota. You have to keep your little animals alive and happy. Feed them every day, give them water every day. If you have to go away for a week, get your neighbor to come in and use it, because you don't want them to die. So it's a little story we tell. It's an amazing invention.
Yeah.
And we've installed, Newton has installed now over 700 of them in the last 5 or 6 years.
Right.
So
it is remarkable, how simple it is, too.
It is.
And the sand that they can get.
Well, it's curious. You can't just use beach sand or river sand. Because if you've ever taken a handful of sand at the edge of the sea and looked at it carefully, you'll notice that every grain of sand has been smoothed and rounded. They're like little mini boulders. They're all, because they've been rolled back and forth by the surf. What Mantz found is that you really need, you should pardon the expression, virgin sand, which is a sand which has never been softened and smoothed. To do that, we buy sand. We buy sand. Edges. Right, exactly. We buy sand from a volcano in the north of the country. It's a country full of volcanoes, by the way. This is an extinct volcano called Motastepe. We buy it at some expense, and we sift it and wash it. But this is volcanic sand that has never been softened and had its rough edges taken. We like the rough edges. That's part of the process.
Okay. All right. So that's one.
That's one thing we do.
One project, and then
another is, as I think I told you before we began. Here's a stunning statistic. More people on this planet, as many as 2 million, will die this coming year of cooking smoke than die of malaria. So we're all horrified of malaria. We think it's this terrible killer. But in fact, cooking on open fires, which is what most people on this planet do to cook their meals, is very dangerous. In Nicaragua, typically
especially in an enclosed space.
Exactly. In Nicaragua, typically it's a shed attached to the house. They sometimes have a raised platform, and they build a little fire on 4 pieces of brick or 3 pieces, three rocks, and they put the pot on top, and they simply feed wood in underneath, like a campfire. But it's a campfire more or less indoors. So
with no exhaust usually.
No exhaust. So my friend Fidel and I, here's a good example. This is what a typical Nicaraguan kitchen looks like in the backwoods. She's got a couple of bricks there on the side, and she's put a couple pieces of metal so that she can support her her pots, her rice and her beans, and she simply puts the wood in the side. I wish I could show you a picture I discovered last week, which shows the roof of one of these kitchens. It's dangling pieces of carbon like stalactites, like dripping from the ceiling. You realize this would be in people's lungs. It's like smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day for everybody in the family that goes into the kitchen, including the children who follow mom around. So Fidel Pavona, my friend Fidel, and I developed what we call our eco stove, which is a cement and brick cooking box with, on the top, 2 circles, one for your rice, or 2 holes really, one for your rice, one for your beans. It's quite shallow. And a 3rd small hole for a chimney. And we make our own chimney stacks out of cement. We have a cement mold that goes right up through the roof. There's Fidel. See the 3 holes? Bottom is rice, middle is beans, top is the chimney. And when we go to the next slide, you'll see that it's been installed. And you put the wood in the bottom. It's like a long rectangle. There, if you put the wood right in the front there, keep the fire going. The air comes in, keeps the fire burning. You can cook 2 different things at once. And there at the end is one of our chimneys. Rises right up. It costs about $30, the materials. You can install one in about 2 hours. And so we have a major campaign going right now, and Fidel has been working on them this week. For instance, I feel
So
that...
it doesn't take much labor to construct it.
Well, I think we did miss a slide of some Simmons College students, some of my students that I took down. They are mixing cement and putting cement into molds and making these, what we call planchetas, these platforms. A plain one for the bottom with no holes in and one with holes. There they are, slapping cement on, having a wonderful time. They got a chance not just to make them, but to go out to the country with us and install them. They're working, by the way, in something we call the Newton Workshop on Appropriate Technology. Appropriate technology means solving people's perennial problems without having to import high tech, without having to use electricity, without having to bring in things from other countries. Using locally available materials, you help people solve problems like clean water, smoke-free cooking. So, and then I'll say one last thing that we like to do, and this is a fairly new project of ours. All of us are deeply, deeply interested in the question of global warming and of climate change. And we realized that the tropics, as we learned this week from the Philippines, the tropics are going to suffer more and earlier and longer from climate change than the temperate zones of the world, the Midwest notwithstanding. So some of us who care about these things have been thinking about products we take for granted, like cement and iron. Most of the buildings around us are made of cement with iron rebar in them. Iron takes an extraordinary amount of energy to produce, to mine it, to smelt it, to process it, to string it out, to ship it. Ditto for cement. It turns out 8% of the world's greenhouse gases come from the manufacture of Portland cement. Because Portland cement is essentially limestone that is baked at high temperatures. How do they bake it? They use petroleum products, which produce greenhouse gases. So there is a whole movement now, which is called the Green Building Materials Movement. And I have a friend who lives in San Juan del Sur, an American, who's been deeply, deeply involved in finding new methods, homemade methods, as it were, for building buildings. I think we have a slide of a wonderful machine we have called the compressed earth block press. It's a manually operated machine which takes a mixture of sand and clay, with a little bit of water, and there we are, and compresses it. Our friend Antonia there is pushing down. She's actually already compressed it. She's about to lift it up. You see in the background those brown brick-like things? Those are earth blocks. They're made out of, there's no cement in them. They're made out of sand and clay, compressed at very high pounds per square inch. We put a big black plastic over them, let them cure slowly, dry slowly for 2 weeks, and they are as hard as rock, harder than most bricks, in fact. No cement is used, locally sourced. It takes a lot of labor to sift the sand and sift the clay, but everyone, we had a good time. And there's, I think, one last slide. We have a picture of a little hexagonal preschool we built for a small community, and we used local trees, fast-growing trees for the uprights, instead of iron and cement. We used bamboo for the shutters rather than wrought iron grills.
Right.
And there you see on the right our compressed earth blocks. On the left, we actually made our own stucco. That was not such a great success. It dried too fast and began to peel, and so we had to do another one with a little bit of cement in it. But what we're trying to do is to show folks that they too can make houses and build schools and do things that they need in their lives using because we lend our machine to anybody that wants to use it, and using low carbon footprint materials.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you must be very much appreciated there.
Well, we have a lot
and your
of
wife both.
We have a lot of friends there.
Yeah,
We really do.
It's remarkable.
And
so tell me, David, about this book.
Well, I am
Dreaming Nicaragua.
I am a novelist also, and the book, which I think there's maybe a slide of, there's the cover, which I wrote after I began to go to Nicaragua. There was in about 1989 something called the Veterans Peace Convoy. A lot of Vietnam veterans who were upset with what Ronald Reagan was doing by declaring war on the second poorest country in the hemisphere, which was Nicaragua. This is the Contra War we're talking about. Many of these Vietnam veterans got together, including the very famous group in Dorchester called the Smedley Butler Brigade of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. They put together a convoy of 100 trucks and buses, and they decided they were going to do something nice for Nicaragua. And they lined these up, and they met from all parts of the country. They headed down to Texas to cross the border into Mexico. They were stopped at the border by the Border Patrol, who said, no, these are enemies of the United States. These school buses could be used as war material. What about the books? What about the oats? What about the clothes? No, you can't go. So there was a summer's worth of flap about that. And finally they were allowed to go. Our son actually, who was in high school at the time, was one of the mascots in that trip. It was a great summer for him. In my novel, one of the members of that brigade, a Vietnam veteran named Jesse Pelletier, who's been through a dreadful divorce and who is suffering probably post-traumatic stress himself, goes down to San Juan del Sur and ends up buying a small, cheap hotel. As the book begins, his daughter, from whom he's been estranged because of the divorce, comes to visit her dad. And they're going to see if they can patch up the father-daughter relationship. While she's there, she actually falls for a local guy, very flamboyant, charming, ecological activist who's trying to save the turtles. So I can't tell you the rest of the plot, but I urge you to buy it. It's published by my own press called FenwayPress.com, which has a number of books now.
Right.
So.
Okay. I know you did mention that that's another adventure, a new adventure of yours, that you started a press, huh?
That's my most recent book for Fenway Press. I'm losing my voice. It's a book of poems by a former student who's Albanian American. Her name is Ani Shika, and our viewers can read about the book by going to FenwayPress.com.
Yeah. Well, you are a man of many talents, I see. And the other thing that I just found out about you was that you're also an actor. So that's...
I'm an actor who's lost his voice.
So what do you do when you're on stage and you lose your voice?
Oh, I notice whisper.
Go to a whisper. Okay, wow.
I was offered today a chance to understudy the great Jay Callahan, who's the lead in this year's Christmas Revels at Sanders Theater.
In Cambridge, Massachusetts. Yeah.
And I've also worked with American Repertory Theater, ART, and with the Actors Shakespeare Project.
Yeah.
I love Shakespeare, and I taught Shakespeare for many years at Simmons. So it's right up my alley.
As a professor, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So.
And so you said you started acting when you were a
Oh
kid,
my goodness,
really.
when I was in college. Well, actually, when I was in high school in North Carolina.
Yeah.
But then when I was in college over at the boys' department at Radcliffe, as we call it. And so I have a long history as a theater guy.
Yeah.
And I've written about the theater and translated from the Italian and a lot of plays.
Right.
And I care deeply about the theater. So curiously, the one thing we don't have in our town, in San Juan, is drama.
Oh, really?
There's some music, there's some painting, but no one's really done drama. So we're working on that because we think that drama is an important part of any community's life.
So how are you working on it?
Well, there's a wonderful local girl from the Boston area whose name is Diani Macus. She's an Emerson College graduate. She lives there now. And she has a little project called the Barrio La Planta project. Barrio La Planta is one of the poorest barrios or neighborhoods in San Juan del Sur. She has an after-school program, which we support, in which kids learn English and do dramatic arts. That's all they do. And sometimes they do their plays in English, and they speak English much better than the kids who study English at the high school. So there is, in fact, some drama down there, and it's charming to see kids throw themselves into their roles and get totally fascinated by taking on an alternative identity.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh. So you're going to be going down to your city soon?
Early January.
Yeah. What will you be doing?
We are going to try a new experiment. In the past, Fidel, whose picture that you saw, would do the eco-stoves, and our other colleague, Antonia Mendoza, would do the biosand filters, and they would do them in different communities. So we thought, well, why not go into find a couple of communities and focus on them for 2014 and make sure that everyone who needs one has a biosand filter and an eco-stove. Saves on transportation, and also it means that instead of building the filters and building the stoves back in San Juan del Sur proper, we're going to take the materials out to these communities and build them on location. People that want these are going to have to work for them. They have to roll up their sleeves and mix cement and use PVC pipe and do it together and sift sand and wash gravel and.
So would you say, though, that in general the people, they realize the value of all these things?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so they want to be involved and they want to get them in their homes?
They do.
Yeah.
There's a kind of what I think is a false idea about, and this is a discussion in the development world, that if you give somebody something for free, they won't appreciate it. It's a kind of cliche. I happen not to believe that. I think that if properly structured, you can actually give people something, and they will appreciate it. But one of the best ways to make that happen is not to ask them for money, but ask them to contribute sweat equity, to put their own labor into it. So now, we didn't do this at first, but now we're asking people to help build their own stoves and to help build their own filters. Up until this year, we've asked them to come into town to do that. So now we're going to bring the whole process to them. So we're hoping that that will be successful.
Yeah. Well, this has just been really lovely and fascinating to hear all that you do.
I hope your viewers, if they're interested in this, will go to our website, our very interesting, wonderful website. It's Newton San Juan, one word, NewtonSanJuan.org. Lots of people, we have testimonies from former volunteers. We have wonderful albums of photographs, and we have an entire sort of YouTube channel.
And you're probably looking for more volunteers.
We absolutely are, of whatever age, It's, by the way, Nicaragua is closer than Los Angeles. You can fly from Boston to Managua almost in the time it takes you to fly to LA. And it's a darling, darling country. It's very safe. It's very beautiful. It's not expensive. It's just on the cusp of its real explosion of tourism. It's going to become Costa Rica North. But we urge people to go to San Juan del Sur. And anyone's interested can contact me through our website.
Well, I bet you might get some takers.
I hope so.
You've certainly talked about it in a beautiful way, David.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And join us next time on A Livelihood when I will have a new guest for you.